Am I still good? Cool. So when I was growing up, I had this green and red suitcase. It could fit approximately 3 pair of my tiny child underwear, 2 shirts, and all of my Beanie Babies. The necessities, right? I would pack that thing and I would imagine unzipping it in exotic places like the Eiffel Tower or Florida. Well, at 6 or 7 years old, I would get all excited packing it up for a sleepover at a friend's house, where my parents would begrudgingly come pick me up at 2:30 in the morning when I couldn't sleep and called home very tearfully. I would also pack that thing up when my mom decided that she was going to embrace her nursing side and encourage me to try to add some healthy elements to my dinner, and her mom's side in trying to get me to, experience new foods and new things, be adventurous. Let me tell you, the night that she put those giant puke green oversized marbles on my plate drizzled with butter and called them Brussels sprouts and told me that they were good for me, I was not happy. So I stormed upstairs and I said, I'm not finishing my dinner, and I packed up my suitcase with a copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, my entire Groovy Girl collection, and maybe my toothbrush. And I hoisted that thing up over my head and I stormed back down the stairs and I threw up in the front door and I said, I'm out of here. College kids can't get out of their parents' basements, but I sure can. And I started walking down the street. I only ran away from home a couple of times, all about the ages of 6 to 8. The first time I didn't get to the end of the driveway before my father was yelling after me, if you don't come back this instant, we're not going to see the new Ice Age movie in theaters. Does that show my age at all? The second time I got to the end of the driveway, a little bit past Mr. McVeigh's house, and I was on to the 3rd house down the road, and my mom yelled after me, but who's going to have my 2-minute snuggle with me tonight? And I turned around and I went home. One of the last few times that I ran away from home, I actually ended up at the end of my street, at the end of the cul-de-sac. And I turned around hoping to hear someone calling for me, and nobody was. And I became very afraid, because all of a sudden, the world was unpredictable, it was chaotic, and I had nowhere to turn. I would either cross a street that I never crossed without my parents, or I would turn a corner and disappear out of line of sight from my house, or I could return and go home and cease my adventure. Well, I outgrew that green and red suitcase. It didn't quite fit everything that I needed in later years, but I certainly didn't outgrow my sense of adventure and curiosity and downright stubbornness. I will call it independence to make it sound a little bit more positive. By the time I graduated from college, I had an amazing opportunity to move to Shanghai, China, and work with a man that I had interned for that previous summer. It was promising adventure and paid travel and international connections and networking with business leaders from all over the world. And despite my student loans weighing in the back of my mind, I thought, this is something I have to do. And so I packed up 6 months of my life and I moved to Shanghai, China, where I found an apartment and learned to assimilate into a culture where I didn't speak the language and didn't know anyone else besides my boss. It was a thrilling adventure for a wide variety of reasons, but I will never forget the day that I found myself in that same position that I was when I was 6 or 7 years old, standing there on the street corner, confused, lost, and unsure where to go. You see, my boss, I had worked with him before, and he was wonderful. He was enthusiastic and encouraging, and he wanted me to do and achieve all of the different projects that he had in the back of his mind. But somewhere, within that year of absence, he had changed. I didn't have any of the equipment that I needed. I was getting paid $7 an hour. I was dreaming about paid travel that he had promised, but it never came. He would use my personal writings against me in the office. He would belittle my work. And I wasn't meeting the people that I thought I was so excited to meet. And so I had to face a tough decision. Do I stay because it's a steady job, even though it's not what I want and it's making me sad? Or do I pack up my suitcase and leave? And I found myself in that exact same position where suddenly the world became chaotic, unpredictable, and terrifying, because I decided that nothing was worth staying for, especially not $7 an hour. And so I quit. Now I had a paid ticket home for a couple months later, And it was more expensive to change that time period than it would be to just go home when I was supposed to. So I took the rest of my savings and I decided to start traveling. I was not prepared for backpacking. I was prepared to stay in hot Shanghai, China, where the weather was predictable and I was prepared for everything. But when I boarded that train out west to the Gobi Desert, things started to change. On my very first train outside of Shanghai, I was headed out to Xi'an for a few days, and I sat down on the train, and next to me was a petite Chinese woman. I had a lot of translators apps, but I did not know how to speak Mandarin. And so a couple hours into the train ride, I started getting bored, and she was happily scrolling through some of her social media websites. And I looked over at one moment, and I was just kind of eavesdropping on her scrolling binge, and she scrolled past a picture that looked quite odd to me, and she started laughing. Has anyone ever seen a dad bod fanny pack? You picture a fanny pack with a gut on the front, so even if you wear it over your shirt, it looks like you've got a stomach hanging out. And she kind of laughed, and she sat back in her seat, at which point she noticed that I had been watching her phone. And instead of freaking out and getting angry with me for invading her privacy, she looked at me and she went, my blonde hair had given it away. I was not a local. And she whipped open her translation app and she started typing all of these things to me, and a short few hours later I knew that she was an educator headed to Xi'an for a history conference. She was a mother of a boy about my age who also liked Rubik's Cubes, which I happened to be playing with in that moment. She told me about her choir performances, and we watched videos of her singing and looked at pictures of her home. She invited me to her hometown to visit one of the mountains nearby. And then at one point, growing hungry, I got up to go to the food cart for something to eat. And unfortunately, amongst all of the chicken feet and strange flavored Lays, I didn't quite find anything that was suitable to my hunger. So I came back with a bottle of tea. She looked at me very upset and very motherly and wanted to take me under her wing, and so she kept trying to offer me food. She wanted me to go back to the food cart with her so that she could buy me whatever and however much I wanted. She was eating a strange type of burrito and literally handed it to me and went, "Do you want a bite?" I went, "No, thank you." And perhaps it was according to local custom, but the third time she offered me a gift, I finally said yes, and she handed me this strange vacuum-sealed package. It was yellow, and it had a stick figure hang gliding underneath a strip of what appeared to be bacon on the front. And so I hesitantly opened it up, and she watched with excitement as I pushed at the bottom and up slid this slimy brown blob. And all of a sudden it was as though a perfume bottle exploded and the entire train car was filled with the aromas of a meat shop. And she looked at me so excited. And so I took a little nibble, and it was spicy, but it wasn't bad. So I took a couple more bites and eventually finished the whole thing, and still to this day I can't quite be sure what I ate, but she was so excited for me. And so when she turned to me and she kind of went, "Is it good?" I went, "Oh, yes, thank you." And so then she proceeded to lean over into her bag and pull out an entire Costco-sized bag of individual wrapped mystery meats. And she tucked it into the back of the seat in front of me. By the time we got off the train, I had realized that I'd made a friend. Whether or not we could actually speak to each other in English, we were brought together by some strange kind of vulnerability and human connection that couldn't be put into words. And as we got off the train and we were standing on the platform, I realized that I had made a horrible mistake because Xi'an was not the 90-degree weather I had been used to. It was about 45 degrees and I was freezing. And she looked at me with concern, and I just pulled my jacket a little tighter with pride and pulled the usual teenage stubbornness of, "Oh, I'm fine." And she looked at me like a mother would, and she leaned over and she unzipped a pouch in her suitcase and she pulled out this yellow silk scarf. Now, this scarf was not going to keep me warm, but as she stood on her tiptoes and wrapped it around my neck, I felt the warmth of her love, unconditional, regardless of background, language, cultural understanding. She wanted to take care of me. She wasn't the first person that I met on my travels that taught me something about unconditional love and what it means to be a fellow human in this unpredictable and chaotic and scary world. I was in Malaysia, lounging around on a beach, and I saw the opportunity to go parasailing, and I thought, "Oh, why not?" So I paid $20 and I was hoisted up into the air where I could see the entire island of Penang from my spot in the sky. And attached with me in my harness was a man that I learned was named Zaman. And by the time we got down, we started kind of chatting lightly. He wasn't very talkative of a guy, but he was friendly, and I had a good energy from him. And so he asked me at one point, short into our conversation, "Have you ever been to Monkey Beach?" And I said, "No. What is that?" And he pointed to a very far off distant point on the island around the peninsula. And he said, "There, Monkey Beach." I didn't really have time for a lengthy hike. But then he looked at me and he said, "Do you want to go with me? My friends used to go, but they don't anymore. And I haven't been in a long time." And in that moment, I could hear my parents' voice going, "We told you not to talk to strangers, not to take drinks, not to get into unknown vehicles," and yet here I was, about to do all three. And I looked at him and I said, "Can I bring a friend?" And he said, "Sure." So I took that as a hint of, all right, well, he wouldn't take on two of us at once, so I should be okay by myself. So I met him at the beach the next morning. I didn't tell my parents what I was doing because I knew what they would say. And he pulls up, not in a car, not in a bus, on a motorbike. And he hands me an extra helmet and goes, "All right, let's go." And I thought, oh, my parents are going to be so mad at me. It was one thing to make it to the end of my street with a tiny suitcase stuffed full of Beanie Babies, but it was another to get onto the back of a stranger's motorbike and ride off into an unknown jungle. I was asking for trouble, but something told me that this was going to be okay. So I climbed onto the back of the motorbike, and I had in the back of my mind that the national park was a straight shot. And if anything went wrong, I'd figure it out from there. And so we start driving past all of the night market stalls and all of the hotels and the restaurants and the seafood places. And all of a sudden, as I'm starting to truly enjoy the breeze on the back of my neck, he turns left, and I panic. Zaman was not a very talkative guy, as I said. But in that moment, I think he could read my mind as he yelled back into the wind, "Don't worry, I'll take you to the national park. I want to show you Penang." And so me being me, and on the back of his motorbike, I just kind of say, "Okay, sure." He stops at a gas station and he takes me inside and he buys me an orange juice for the road. And then he takes me up the winding roads into the jungle where he shows me a hidden waterfall. And he takes me to a fruit stand so I can try the stinkiest fruit in the world called durian. It smells like feet and tastes like stale mango, and that's the best marketing I can give it. And then on the way back down towards the national park, he pulled over to the side of the road, and surely I thought, this is where I make the mistake of a lifetime and I disappear forever. And he hopped off the bike and he looked at me and he said, "Your turn." And I looked at him as my mother probably would have looked at me if I would have told her this story in advance. And I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Your turn." So I took off down the road on the island of Penang, weaving in and out on the motorbike by myself. And I teasingly drove past him, asking if he wanted a ride, and he'd stand there and laugh. And then I stopped, pulled over, and he got on the back, and he let me drive the rest of the way. And I thought, now this is interesting, because I was terrified to get on the back of this man's bike, not even 5 hours earlier. And yet here he is giving me his only mode of transportation around the island and letting me drive it by myself. I was sure I had found the eat, pray, love scenario of traveling through Malaysia. And so we hike through the national forest together, and it is sweaty and it is disgusting, and I feel so tired. And we get to Monkey Beach, and we share a coconut, and then he says, "There's a lighthouse. We'll go there." Now this is a hike that I can't even say fairly that a fit person would not be covered in sweat and gasping for air. It was exhausting. And about halfway through I considered going, you know what, this is just too much, I can't, I'm dehydrated. But I kept pushing through because he kept going and I was not about to give up. And we sat atop that lighthouse, and it was as though he could read my mind once again, and he looked at me and he said, "You have to trust to be happy. You cannot be happy if you cannot trust." He said, "Trusting everyone risks heartbreak. It does. It's hard. But trusting no one guarantees loneliness." And I thought about the way that I had been traveling and the people that I had met so far, and how each of those people somehow knew in their hearts that we had some kind of connection. There was New from the train. There was Zaman from Malaysia. There was Mike and Ike, who I simultaneously met in a grand fashion of comedy. There was a woman that I met on the sand dunes of China who just wanted to do yoga with me. She didn't want to talk. She just wanted to do yoga. There was another woman I met where we went on a tour around Chengdu, southern of Chengdu, and we went into people's homes and they gave us tea and they told us about their families and their histories. They opened their lives to us simply because we were curious enough to ask and polite enough to listen. I started to collect these extraordinary stories of people who are ordinary, like you and me, people who go about their everyday life doing what they're passionate about and somehow still makes a difference in everyone's eyes. I came back from Asia with $1,000 in my pocket, a whole lot of adventure, and so many stories. But most of all, I came back recognizing that there is something that I do every day that matters to someone. And there is something that all of you do every day that someone looks at you and goes, that is incredible. It could be as simple as waking up in the morning. But those kinds of stories and those kinds of feelings aren't things that need to be transcribed. It's a feeling. Gui Ren is a written Chinese phrase that means the right people coming into your life with synchronicity to help inspire you and guide you. And I'm so thrilled to have these stories to share with you to remind you that everything that you do as an ordinary human being is 100% extraordinary to someone nearby. Thank you.